Hey, you know what? What's really great about this car is the fact that it's this wonderful gold color, and of course I love twin turbo 6s. There's nothing like a twin turbo 6. Nothing beats it at all.
Except for a single turbo 4.
Hi, and welcome back to our exhibition JDM and Beyond, the worldwide influence of Japanese automobiles, here at the Audrain Automobile Museum in Newport, Rhode Island. Today, I'm joined once again by my friend Steve Marsocci, and in this segment we're going to talk about some of the cars that really make people think of JDM and that smoky pursuit of drift. So we've got some interesting cars, and talking about the way these cars are adaptable and how sometimes they change, like a lot of competition cars do, from what the stock car starts out as and what we end up with in the performance versions. We're going to start out by talking about some cars that are very familiar to US enthusiasts, because you could buy them in the showrooms here, and some cars which seem like the things you could buy, but aren't quite what they are.
Yeah.
Exactly. Starting with one of my favorite cars, the Mazda RX-7. And I've been a big fan of the Mazda RX-7 from the time they're introduced, and by the time you get to this generation of Mazda RX-7 in 1993, I think that they really had perfected the art of the sports car. I mean, Mazda, of course, is brilliant. I mean, God knows, everybody thinks of Miata and sports car. The fact that they stuck with the rotary power plant as long as they did, and in a car like the RX-7, it's a really very different driving experience. And in the stock car, you get a sense of sort of seamless power and great balance. It's almost front and mid-engined, and it's really so incredibly well designed, with a great low center of gravity and all the things that make you really love a responsive sports car. Mm-hmm. So the other car we have in this pair is also a 1993 RX-7, but with a slightly different bent. Tell us about this car, the Falcon RX-7.
Well, to backtrack a little bit and go to that car, like you said, it evolved over time. And it was always a car that was prominent in drifting. Even the FCs, the previous generation, were huge. They started to realize that they were fantastic cars for the sport. And then when it got to the FD, it was perfected. You know, you have super low center of gravity, great weight distribution, great torque, and a high revving engine. So you can go into a corner sideways, put your foot down on that throttle, and it'll carry you right through that corner.
You know, that's something very interesting, and we'll talk about this as we look at the other cars in this segment. One of the things that unites all of them is power delivery, and that's, I think, is something that is worth explaining to a lot of people watching this who may not be familiar with what makes a good drift car. Mm-hmm. And you know, for me personally, I like a car that delivers its power throughout the range, and that happens to be one of the greatest attributes of a great drift car.
Yeah, absolutely. It starts with, you know, front engine, rear wheel drive, and then, you know, people debate about where they want their power, but you got to have those long gears. You got to have an engine capable of revving high and staying on that limiter for a long time.
Staying on the limiter for a long time, but also with a certain amount of torque, so that you can get, you can really play with the throttle, because it's all about playing with the throttle. So exactly.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about this one a little.
So this one was built by Chris Forsberg and Tony Angelo, right in the beginning of Formula Drift. It drifted, moved over from Japan to America. It was now an American sport with Formula Drift, and they decided they would build this. It was just the two of them in their garage messing around. It wasn't the most successful in competition, but it helped establish drift as a respected sport, mostly because of this Falcon livery. I mean, Falcon was part of racing. People recognized the livery, and when they saw those videos of this car, people just started to understand, oh, drifting is something real. It's not a playtime for, you know, people that like to spin tires. It takes skill.
And Formula Drift was also quite interesting in that it started out as an amateur competition which became professional, And it also established itself in a national way, in a very clever and interesting way, by bringing together regional groups that would all compete towards a national drift championship, which also helped to really create a sort of groundswell, local grassroots kind of thing, where people could go and build their cars, go out and compete, and if they had the time and the budget and the inclination, they could keep going and go to a national level. If they didn't, you just had the fun you wanted to have.
That's exactly right. I mean, Chris Forsberg is now a 3-time champion of Formula Drift, but when they started, they were grassroots guys. They started drifting in the late 90s, and it wasn't popular in America yet. It was mostly just a Japanese sport, and they stuck with it, and they created Drift Alliance, which is, we're going to get really technical here. Drift Alliance is basically a group of friends, these grassroots drifters, that wanted to create a professional league to be, you know, what they saw overseas in America. So they created Drift Alliance, and they put out these VHS tapes that were like what they saw in Japan from Keiichi Tsuchiya and Plus B Tuning and Option Magazine. And now we have a national series that people tune into every year.
And it's interesting too, we talked about the basic characteristics that lend a stock car that performs well to become a drift car. Now this car, one of the things that we saw when it was being loaded here into the gallery was the fact that, you know, sometimes it's a bit of a challenge to maneuver the cars here inside the museum. However, the great advantage of having drift cars in is their extreme turn-in angles. And so, you know, it's also an interesting thing that a car can be modified to accept the suspension modifications required while still keeping the basic silhouette of the car as well. Because these cars, unlike a lot of other cars, which we will talk about in a bit, are very true to their roots as well. It's not that whole sort of silhouette racer thing where it sort of looks like an RX-7 but really isn't an RX-7.
Right, and we'll really see that with the next car, which is, you know, the Japanese way of building a drift car is a little bit different than the American way, which it's evolved into.
It's one of those things, this is a really great candidate because it's got this, this, and this. So let's change that. Let's take a look, Steve.
Yeah.
Now, Steve, we're looking at a car that really sort of defines why people are so crazy about JDM. Now, the Nissan Silvia was sold here under many generations as first the 200SX, then the 240SX, and that was the S13 model. This is the S15. Just as is so often the case, when the going gets really good, the plug gets pulled. Now, the 240SX is a really terrific little sports car, or sporty car, I should say. But this, the last generation of the S15, was the ultimate in the small platform. So take us through this one.
It was the culmination of every one before it. It got all the good parts. It got a great limited slip differential, amazing suspension. Everything was strengthened for one purpose: drifting, motorsport.
Well, I was going to say in motorsport, because the S13 was very successful in a number of different motorsports venues in circuit racing, as well as the fact that this was the last of the Nissan mid-sized sports cars to have traditional front-engine, rear-wheel drive configuration before everything went front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. So, you know, it's again, that whole idea of versatility, tunability, the idea that people can take a car and tune it to their specific needs and goals. So what makes this car so special?
Well, the S chassis is by far one of the most successful and popular Japanese chassis for any kind of motorsport. I think when Nissan built this, they understood what people were going to use it for, and they wanted them to use it for that. So they strengthened everything. They made it better. They made it so you could tune it. These cars were huge when you looked at the mountains of Japan. Toge was coming out, the people were drifting, and
Toge. Now Toge, for those who don't speak fluent Japanese the way my friend Steve does, Toge is Japanese for pass. Mm-hmm. And it comes not from passing somebody on the road, but from the mountain passes, the great roads. And people think of Japan as being a very small place. They think of Tokyo, they think of crowded cities. Once you get outside the cities in Japan, The roads are amazing, and Japan also, as a volcanic island, as a series of volcanic islands rather, is also a place where you go from the sea level at the ocean to great elevation very quickly. So some of the Japanese mountain roads are the equal of any you'll run into in the Alps or in the Rockies. So quite amazing roads. And as we mentioned before in an earlier video, the Japanese are very disciplined people, much like the Swiss or the Germans. And they have very strict speed limits. But there arose a group of young Japanese enthusiasts who thought, hey, we've got a really capable car, we've got these really great mountain passes, let's do something that we're not supposed to do.
That's exactly right. These street racers, these hashiriyas, were inspired by racing car drivers. Keiichi Tsuchiya was the big one. Before him was Kunimitsu Takahashi. All of these drivers were, drifting wasn't its own sport at the time. It was a style of driving. So these racing car drivers from, even Le Mans, they had a certain style of driving, and these hashiriyas were catching on, and they wanted to try it out. So they, out of respect, went to the mountains of Japan where it was a little bit safer rather than the cities, and they took their cars to
Don't
the
try
limits.
this at home, by the way. Do not think because you're on a mountain it's safer to drive your car at great speeds and at wide angles, but I digress.
So they took them out into the mountains, and it started to catch on as a sport, and Daijiro Inada, who founded Tokyo Auto Salon, recognized this as he was a hashiriya himself, and he created Ikaten, which was the first sanctioned and legal series. That evolved into the All Japan Drifting Championship, and then it became D1GP, which you see right up there. D1GP was in Japan from 2000 until 2003, and then they moved to the US, where this car competed, and it won in 2004. It was a little bit
Won
of
the championship in 2004.
Yes, it won the championship in 2004. It was a little bit of a digression for Top Secret, as they were used to building top speed cars, which we'll see later. But somehow they built something that would succeed in drifting, and here it is.
And it's also very interesting. Again, I'm an old guy. I like old guy racing, and I love the idea that everything old is new again. Back in the day, probably before basically the 1970s, the fastest way to get a race car around a corner was to drift around a corner. You didn't drive a car around the corner because tire technology and suspension technology was not at the point where you could actually do that accurately. If you wanted to go fast, you drove straight into a corner, unsettled the car, threw the steering wheel around, the car shifted, and you went. And so it's really interesting to me to see that what they did back in 1900 to go fast around corners, especially on mountains, they were doing now in the 1990s and 2000s and today. And so it's really a thing that I will just say personally for myself, and we can get lots of comments in the comments section of this video. If you disagree with me, if you agree with me, also make your comments as well. The kind of drifting that I really like are the organized events where you see the cars going through a circuit of drifting, as opposed to cars just going around in a circle making tire smoke.
Right.
It's the artistry of where this started and the car control that is what it's all about for me.
It's a dance.
Yeah.
It's a dance of the driver and the car. And it's really remarkable when you look at this one compared to the FDRX7 that we just looked at. When you get underneath it, you see a lot of the parts are stock S15. It has the stock handbrake, the stock transmission, and a very mildly modified engine. So it was a great car to begin with, and it shows the balance of the car and the balance of the drivers.
Now we're going to go a little more deeply into modifications, and we'll see where that gets us. And it might get us, who knows, to the movies. Come on. In an earlier segment, we saw a stock version of the Nissan Skyline GT-R, the R32, and now this is an R34, 2 generations later. Godzilla returns,
Yep.
and as we saw with the earlier car, all of the amazing Japanese technology intact. You know, the all-wheel drive, the four-wheel steering, all of the technological marvels that you could do to get power to the road. So here we have an example of the R34, which again, I think it tells such an amazing story of adaptability. A car built for drag racing, circuit racing, and drifting.
Yes.
What do we got here, Steve?
It tells a fantastic story. All of that technology is gone.
Exactly.
It's no longer all-wheel drive, it's rear-wheel drive. So the rear-wheel steering is gone as well. It's been through 4 different configurations in its lifetime, like you said, drag racing, circuit racing, and now drifting. It started out as a drag car. Kazuke Matkita was a Hashiriya himself, as many young Japanese men were. He started Bob Racing, which is his little group of street racers. He quickly got involved with the Bosuzoka gang and realized it probably wasn't the lifestyle that he wanted to live. So he left street racing and opened up his shop, Signal Auto. Signal Auto focused on customer cars for a long time, and then Kazuke got bored and said, I think I want to build race cars again. And he built this. Started out as a drag car with 1,000 horsepower, twin turbo, like they came from the factory, with upgraded turbos, of course. Bored out to 2.8 liters from the RB26 that it came with, and capable of doing 9-second quarter miles very easily. On street radial tires, by the way. There used to be a sticker on this car, the RH9 Club, and that was 9-second quarter miles on street radials. Occasionally this one actually dipped into the 8 seconds. So they did that very well. It was super successful in drag racing, and he said, let's change it up. And they started to go after Tsukuba circuit. So it was built again. One of the turbos came off, a Greddy T88 went on, some better cams for circuit racing went in, and it did sub 1 minute at Tsukuba circuit. And then he said, maybe we'll change it up again and we'll go after some US circuits. So some milder, some more mid-range cams went in, a different turbo went on, and again, he was successful in setting several records in this car. And then after this car, the S15 did D1 GP. He entered this in Formula Drift, and power came down to 670 horsepower, and I guess we really got to see what those rear-wheel drive setups were made for.
It's so interesting because we've spoken before on this channel about the fact that performance is far more than mere horsepower. And what you just described is a great example of tuning a car for a purpose. For the drag racing, you needed the horsepower, you needed to be able to put that down as quickly as possible for those quick runs to get that sub 9-second time. But then for the circuit racing, you need a little bit more balance. You need a wider, more usable power band. You need to get on the power earlier to use the power in a different way. And then finally for drifting, you need to have that kind of flexibility that you need. So 1,000 horsepower in drifting is not going to give you more than a usable 600 or 700 horsepower in a range that you can actually use. And to me, that's fascinating. It's something that I think a lot of people who don't understand cars like this don't realize that they're more or less, again, I'm not insulting anybody out there, but the people that just worship at the altar of horsepower miss the entire point of focused performance. And that's what this is all about, focused performance. And the idea that you can develop a car to do so many different things also speaks basically to the basic chassis integrity and dynamics of these cars. The fact that, everyone loves to modify a car, but I still like to think that this is still within the spirit of what the Nissan engineers who originally designed these cars thought, let's try to do this. And these are always, of course, dual purpose cars. These were cars that were designed, you can actually still, when the cars were being loaded into the museum, yes, it was awfully dramatic to hear them start up in the trailer and the loping cams as they, attempted to hold an idle as they drove up the ramps is one thing, but nonetheless, they're actually cars you can drive on the street. They're not impossible to drive.
Yeah, I mean, this actually started out as a street race car, and then it evolved. But it's an icon of tuning, and Signal Auto is an icon of the Japanese tuning car industry.
And one of their other technological marvels that they're always known for is their paint schemes. And this has this amazing color shift paint scheme that, I'm standing right over here, I've got purple, I look past you, it goes to gold and then into a bit of green. It's absolutely fantastic. And again, thinking about Japanese culture and design, the fabrics and prints, this is so incredibly Japanese. It just fits the cultural image and type so well.
Yeah, and it's a great testament to the history of Signal Auto, which is no longer around. Show Up Paint, which was a subsidiary of Signal Auto, also a dream of Kazuke Madkita. It was connected to the Signal Auto shop, but when they had to close up the racing industry, Show Up continued, and they still produce this Matsuura paint.
Absolutely astonishing. Now, for our final car in this grouping, we're going to see a car produced by not only a legend, but probably the legend, the man who, through his imagination and skill, brought all of this mountain racing and street racing to the point that it has today. Let's take a look at a true top secret masterpiece.
Let's do it.
We got to see the pair of RX-7s, and now we're standing in front of a Supra. Those of you who watch this network, and even those who haven't watched it until now, can go right here and watch me driving a wonderful Supra twin turbo, a really terrific high performance car. And people have a tendency to say, well, Toyota's just sort of lost the high performance urge after the 2000 DT. But those are people who have not experienced a Toyota Supra twin turbo, which is an amazing performance car. And of course, this masterpiece in gold performance art has got to be the ultimate in a twin turbo 6-cylinder Supra, right?
No. This is actually a single turbo 4-cylinder.
Explain.
Well, Smokey was inspired by the Japanese Grand Touring Car Championship and the Tom's Castrol Supra, which ran
Smokey Nagata.
Smokey Nagata, sorry.
Okay.
Smokey Nagata was actually inspired by the Tom's Castrol Supra, which ran the Celica GT4's 4-cylinder. He had built two other Supras before this, both RB26 powered, which is a whole other argument. But he wanted to build something that looked and acted and performed as that car did. So he got the kit, he got the engine, and he created this 700 horsepower monster.
And it's one of those things, again, we talked about what the characteristics are of a particular chassis and model that makes it the required or desired choice for a tuner or a car builder. And so what was it about the Supra and the design, the chassis that drew Smokey to it, and yet he built something rather different than what the Toyota engineers built?
I mean, you'd have to ask Smokey himself. He built two other cars before this, both A80 Supras. One of them quite famous for its illegal top speed run in the UK, which proves its aerodynamic shape. Did 197 miles per hour on public roads, and Smokey was pulled over and arrested and banned from the UK for quite some time. But eventually he came to building this, which participated in the Option Top Speed Challenge. It didn't live up to Smokey's expectations. The turbo seals failed a few times, and I think they only came up around 109 miles per hour with this car. But Smokey said he's gotten it over 200, so I guess we'll have to see.
Well, one of the other things is the fact that he was very, very drawn to challenges. We talked a little bit about how the drift scene grew out of this illegal mountain racing, and then you also had just the regular street racing, which was common in Japan as it is in the US, and the idea that you want to build a car that can go really fast, but again, it's about safety quickly, because he's doing these high-speed challenges, obviously illegal, on public roads, but he also had a tendency to pick very isolated times and very isolated roads to do them on.
The top speed run in the UK was at 4 a.m. I mean,
yeah.
He didn't want anybody getting hurt, except for maybe himself. But yeah, no, he even said that when he builds a car, he looks at safety. I mean, when you're taking a car up to these speeds, it's something you look at. You want a car that's tight and right, and it's going to keep you safe in the event of an accident. Of an
unfortunate occurrence.
Yeah.
One of the other things that we see in all of these cars, and we should also share here the fact that this car, the Silvia, the Skyline R34, all loaned very generously by our friends at Redline Restorations, yes. Who are absolutely passionate about these cars. What's really terrific that although these cars are owned by a restoration shop, they understand the responsibility that a caretaker has in allowing a largely original car, as original as a high-performance car like this can be, that has obviously been painted and touched up any number of times, but it shows its character, shows its life with the cracks in the fiberglass and the road rash and all of those things that say this is a car that's alive, that's had an event or had a life.
Yeah, you have to preserve this history, otherwise it's just another Supra.
Exactly.
There's plenty of tuner Supras, but there's only a few Smokey Nagata Supras.
Absolutely extraordinary. Well, thanks so much, Steve, and thank you for watching this segment of highlights from our exhibition, JDM and Beyond, the worldwide influence of Japanese automobiles. Come back to the Audrain Museum Network to see yet other highlight videos from this exhibition. You'll be absolutely amazed and hopefully entertained by the great range and wonder of these Japanese cars. Thanks.